I'd just like to start by saying that although it seems to be about a very narrow topic, in some ways I hope I will raise some questions about some of the things that were said yesterday. For Edmund Campion, Latin was definitely his first language. He spoke, wrote poetry in Latin, preached in Latin, prayed in Latin, and in fact right up to his last words on the scaffold, which were from the Symbolum Apostolorum Vitam Aeternam. He also traveled 5,000 miles over Europe, half of it as a pilgrim on foot. And I think in that sense, he's more like a medieval scholar, although he sort of neatly fits into the category of early modern scholar. And finally, I think for him, the culture of Roman poetry and Greek was at one with his firm commitment to the apostolic and Catholic Church. I think his frequent use of Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example, for him elided into the whole question of the Eucharist. By way of opening comments, I hope making it clear that it's not such a narrow topic. Within minutes of the opening of the first disputation in the Tower of London, the Dean of St. Paul's accused Campion of lying when on the second page of the Rationes Decem he said that Luther had dismissed the Epistle of St. James as an empty epistle made of straw, tumidam aridam stramineam. They said they had consulted every copy they could find in London and there was no such phrase there. Campion replied that if they gave him time he could have a copy fetched from the Duke of Bavaria's library, where he had recently made notes from an early edition of Luther. They laughed at going all the way to Germany for a book, but he was right. The phrase was in the 1529 Jena edition, and Campion had copied those words very faithfully while he spent 2 weeks on his way from Prague to Rome in the residence of the Duke of Bavaria. This book, the Rationes Decem, started and finished in the heart of Europe. If we know an unusual amount about the book's reception, we also know almost everything about its prehistory, its conception, writing, checking, printing, and binding, including almost uniquely the names of everyone, including servants, involved in the printing. Yet only 5 copies of the original edition are known to have survived. When the 2 Jesuits, Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion, came back from the country to London at the end of October 1580, they held a conference that marked the end of the mission as originally conceived and planned. Even in the country, the search, especially for Campion, had intensified to the point where such a ministry was almost impossible. Although light and spirit were brought back again to poor England, the priests and the whole Catholic community found that a rigid persecution was at their heels. They decided that the only way they could reach a wider audience was by writing. Those at Uxbridge suggested that Campion, besides his occupation of preaching and instructing, should write something also in the Latin tongue unto the universities. Campion thought about their request and asked them what they would suggest. There were as many matters proposed as were diverse men. Some proposed writing some consolation unto Catholics in this time of persecution, others to encourage the weak to make a stand, others that he should write some points of controversy. When Campion had heard their views, he paused a while, said they were all good ideas, but if it were his own choice, he would write De Haeresie Desperata, to show that heresy did now despair in England. When they laughed, given that it seemed most to flourish in England and to threaten persecution, Campion replied calmly that their cruel proceeding by terror is the greatest argument that may be of their desperation. Traces of this argument are visible in the first chapter of the Rationes Decem, where Campion, as you can see on this slide, uses desperatio in an effective anaphora as a repeated answer to a series of rhetorical questions about what has driven the heretics to reject books of the Bible. To escape the hue and cry, it was decided that Campion should return again to the country until the present tempest of persecution was blown over. They settled on Lancashire, first because it was more distant from London and more generally affected to the Catholic religion, and secondly because there was more hope for him to find a commodity of books for him to write or answer the heretics. They assumed that since his challenge was now spread over England and the main subject of conversation in inns, taverns, and public meetings, it would soon be answered. As Campion was leaving Discadens, seeing that many books full of lies would be published against him, he strongly recommended that we should see about setting up a press. Almost immediately, Stephen Brinkley offered his help. Within a month of Campion's suggestion, Brinkley and Parsons had set up a printing press at Green Street House, East Ham. Brinkley found a man willing to sell a press at a round rate and all that belonged unto it, types, forms, ink, and given the need for absolute secrecy, put together a team of older priests, presumably Marian priests. To avoid suspicion, he dressed them all as footmen and rode about the streets of London with them in this uniform. Once in Green Street House, 7 miles out of London, they climbed out of their costumes. Although Campion suggested the printing press, Parsons immediately used it, printing first a brief discourse containing certain reasons why Catholics refused to go to church, then a brief censure upon 2 books written in answer to Mr. Edmund Campion's offer of disputation, and thirdly, a discovery of J. Nichols, the renegade priest. Campion left Uxbridge for Lancashire on the 16th of November. He was still travelling on horseback, as he says in his letter to the Jesuit General Mercurian, ob equito quotidie, staying only 1 day in houses where Catholics lived alongside heretics, saying Mass in the early hours and leaving before dawn. Where the household was wholly Catholic, Campion might stay 2, 3, or 4 days together. In the 3rd week of Lent, Campion's guide, Mr. Smith, took Campion to Mount St. John, an isolated house in the parish of Felixkirk, belonging to William Harrington. At Easter, he was at Mr. Harrington's house in Yorkshire, with Lord Burleigh. There he was busy at his study and made a good piece of his Latin book. He was there actually from the 3rd week of Lent till Easter, the 26th of March, about 3 weeks. Campion was still preaching every day. 80 years later, in 1660, people remembered the topics of his sermons: the angelic salutation, on the 10 lepers, on the king setting out for a far country, and on the last judgment. The crowds that flocked to hear them with such enthusiasm that men in numbers and of notable families would pass whole nights in neighbouring barns in order to be present the next morning. They were captivated less by his eloquence or elocution than by the warmth with which he spoke, and some hidden force in his way of speaking, which proceeded from nothing less than the Holy Spirit, says Henry Moore. He preached every day except when he had to withdraw from the throng of besiegers in order to write. The writing, then, was an adjunct of the preaching, which may account for the pastoral clarity and personal freshness of the style. The original plan to write the work in a house with a large library in Lancashire obviously yielded to work in the Harringtons' secluded house. Campion later wished to retrieve his books from Lancashire, so he must have taken his notebooks, perhaps with quotations culled from Luther and Calvin in Munich, from Mount St. John, and finished the Rationes Decem at Park Hall, the house of Richard Horton. The writing could have been spread over several weeks. After sending down the manuscript, he returned south, summoned by Parsons, who had procured another place for a print, the house of the Stoners, standing in a wood fast by Henley. When Parsons received the manuscript, he was immediately struck by the unusual number of marginal glosses. Parsons at first sight was much moved at the world of testimonies, which he saw, as the manner is, in the margin of the book, fetched from all antiquity and quoted out of their several places, where they were to be found in ancient writers, insomuch that they almost fill the whole margin of the book. Parsons was conscious the adversaries would search, canvass, and examine till their very hearts ached the references fetched from all antiquity, and so wrote to Campion to ask if he was sure that all his citations were correct. Campion said he was, but asked that they should try even to the quick all the references. Parsons engaged Thomas Fitzherbert for this scholarly diligence. Fitzherbert, who by reason of his noble extraction and learning had all the London libraries at his command. One wonders what these London libraries were. Says that Parsons gave the manuscript to him in written hand to be printed, and told him that it was Father Campion's, and therefore recommended it to me not only to read, but also to examine the places of the fathers alleged therein, because I might have more free recourse to public libraries in London than priests or religious could have. Besides, that after it was printed, Father Campion himself gave me one of the first printed copies of his own work. Fitzherbert was in Viscount Montague's household, so this must have been his first place of research. Parsons always refers to Stoner Park as Villa Silvestris, the house in the woods. The Stoners had long had it in possession, nestling deep in a valley between high outcrops of the Chilterns, and it's surrounded by ancient woods full of deer and bellowing stags, a fair park and fair woods. The woods, populated by deer in Campion's time, came almost down to the house itself and must have made it feel very safe. The major appeal of the house, however, was its closeness to Henley, and by that means accommodated with navigation on the Thames, so all necessaries, especially paper, which was very bulky and difficult to transport, could be discreetly conveyed there. Father William Morris, a learned and experienced priest who was in charge of procuring the paper, also found the house. The physical location of the house was only one factor in the choice. Generations of Stoners had been sheriffs of Oxfordshire, as was Dame Cecily Stoner's son, Francis, at the time of Campion's capture in Berkshire. The Browns and the Stoners were also connected by marriage. Cecily Stoner was a daughter of Sir Leonard Chamberlain, and her brother in Antwerp, George Chamberlain, had lent his military uniform to Parsons to wear as a disguise. Parsons apparently looked very funny in it. Campion must have reached Stoner before the end of May, and Campion and Parsons were certainly together there on the 3rd of June, when Parsons received a letter from Aquaviva. While Campion and Parsons were together again, Campion was preaching every day in London and would ever and anon interrupt his speech with tears of joy streaming down his cheeks. A long tradition at Stoner locates the press in the attic. There's enough space here for several men to work. The original team of older priests had now given way to 7 men listed in the Concertatio. The printer, Stephen Brinkley, Father William Hartley, who was in charge of the distribution, and everybody else was called John. John Stoner, James Cecily's other son, and 4 servants, John Harris, John Harvey, John Tucker, and John Compton. All were arrested when the press was seized on the 6th of August, but Compton yielded under the threat of torture. The book was octavo in 4s, so printed on half sheets because of the paucity of Roman type. Each form had to be printed before the next form could be set up. The attic would have been full of half sheets of printed paper drying. These 6 weeks must have been one of the best periods of Campion's year in disguise, in which he was busy preaching and seeing his book through the press, and enjoyed the continuous camaraderie of fellow priests and layman assistants, and the sounds and smell of a printing press. His father was a publisher. The printing of Rationes Decem took the best part of a month, from late May till about the 20th of June. This book in all its aspects bears Campion's stamp. The font of Rationes Decem can be distinguished from that of a brief censure, which came from the same press at Henley Park. Where Parsons had used black letter, Campion chose to use Roman type throughout as appropriate to a Latin text. This, by the way, is the newly appeared Winster copy. I'll say a bit more about that later on. Parsons' black letter text is only relieved by the quotations and marginal glosses in Roman, whereas Campion's Roman type has the contrast of some of the quotations and marginal glosses in italic and more white space on the page. The title page has the same impressa as a brief censure, but with the IHS oval now enclosed by a quotation from Luke in a rectangular border in italics. I will give you speech and wisdom that all your opponents will not be able to resist or contradict. This is a book printed by a stationer's son with an eye for an aesthetically pleasing mise-en-page. Dr. Allen's letter of the 23rd of June 1581 says of Campion that he has 7 men continually at work at a press outside of London, where the noise of the machine is less likely to betray it. The printers were working round the clock at Stoner Park to have Campion's challenge ready for the University Act, a 3-day celebration of speeches and prizes which began in St. Mary's Church, Oxford, on the 27th of June 1581. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin was arranged for the commencement with scaffolding in manner of the theatre, as for the Queen's visit in 1566, with an upper tier added to hold the crowd. So popular was the event, Bombino tells us, that the benches were filled several hours before the candidates presented their dissertations and received their prizes. Father William Hartley took the books to Oxford for binding by Roland Jenks, who was nationally notorious as a Catholic binder ever since his trial in July 1577 became known as the Black Assizes. Jenks had been sentenced in Oxford to lose his ears for publishing requisite material. Almost immediately, the entire court, including Sir William Babington and Anthony Pollard, was struck with a deadly fever and died, and there died in Oxford 300 persons, says Holinshead. Parsons says that his book was printed and most part of the copies sent to Oxford. The remaining copies, it's now clear, were sent downriver to Southwark for binding, where they were bound up with speed in Jenks's shop, probably close to St. Mary's. Hartley laid some on the empty benches in the church, some he handed to people as they arrived before dawn. So when it grew light, there was an amazing sight. There was an unusual silence of the academics throughout the theatre. The eyes of all were intent on their furtive reading of the book they had found in their hands. The officials sitting on the dais, unaware of the reason, were amazed at the cold atmosphere and what seemed like a disgraceful silence. I think it's very, very interesting. The only times that you get silence when Campion is speaking are extraordinary moments of intensity. Elizabethan audiences were very, very noisy and given to hissing or humming or all these things. Campion's book, the Rationes Decem, electrified the whole academic establishment. Its 40 octavo leaves contained 10 reasoned arguments as to why Catholic and Apostolic Church was the true church and why the arguments of Luther and Calvin were intellectually absurd. The initial impact that June morning did not diminish as the days passed. Scarcely was there anyone to whom this book was either by chance or purposely offered, but it went forthwith from hand to hand amongst many. This is a book that profoundly affected readers. Many laid aside their heresy, many were inflamed by a desire to hear Campion. This was a challenge in Latin from a leading Oxford scholar, now famous in Prague and Rome, using the type that had become standard across Catholic Europe. Campion may have written the book secretly, but this is a very public sermon in print addressed personally to its readers, especially the Queen, who is named and invited Audi Elisabetta Regina Potentissima, in apostrophe to join other European princes, making herself worthy of her ancestors, her intelligence, her academic prowess, her praises, and her fortune. Campion claims loyalty for Catholics, saying that on the last day, veniet Elisabetta dies, ille dies. There it is in that passage at the bottom of the left-hand side. The Queen will discover whether it is the society of Jesus or Luther's brood that has loved her most. Campion had found the Achilles heel of the newly established church, since the Queen clearly loathed Calvin's doctrines and despised the Calvinists. Bishop Aylmer, when asked by Lord Burleigh to find theologians to respond to Campion, replied that none of our church mean to defend Luther's hyperbolas, or all things that have passed the pens of Calvin or Beza. Others were excited by the argument. Campion's argument may have been theological, but it was suffused with his personal warmth. He'd made the entire establishment feel that it had to enlist the most learned to answer his theological challenge. For a brief moment, the two Jesuits could feel that their mission, forced into the inner secrecy of Catholic households, was now at last able to take the debate to the hearts of the people and of the authorities. William Hartley returned cheerfully to Campion and Parsons, but the moment of elation was as transitory as the dawn light in St. Mary's. A few days later, Hartley casually mentioned that he had heard that a certain journeyman whom Jenks had hired in brawling had threatened to report him for the Catholic books and written by a Catholic, which he knew were in a certain stranger's chamber in London, and that he was well assured of what he affirmed, for that he himself had helped Rowland to bind them. The servant had immediately set off for London in a rage. As Hartley was thus discoursing, Parsons, who all this while had heard him with change of countenance, his colour often coming and going, asked him how many days it was since he heard of this news, and Hartley answering, it was some 4 days since, and withal perceiving Parsons so betroubled, demanded whether the matter anything concerned either him or Campion. Yea, verily doth it, says Parsons in manner, wholly concern me. For know you, the chamber you speak of, into which Jinks so unluckily brought that fellow, is mine, mine the books which you say were there bound up, myself and the stranger who set them a work, and by, taking Campion to a side, told him, assuredly, if Hartley say truth, your books are all lost, and both you and I in danger. Parsons, fearing the chamber would be ransacked by the Privy Council, ordered George Gilbert to saddle his horse and ride as fast as he could to London, and covertly dissembling the matter, ride down the street past the rented lodging to try to find out what was happening. It was 2 days' ride to Southwark. Gilbert came back to report that he had first passed through the street and found it bristling with sorrowful silence, except for the sound in some of the houses of women weeping, the most notable for her grief being the landlady of Parsons' lodgings. From her, Gilbert found out that the night before, Sir Thomas Wilkes, secretary to the council, with 100 armed men had entered the lodging, which her husband let to a certain strange gentleman, Parsons had not given his name, where they had seized a world of pardons and indulgences from the Pope, beads, grains, and Agnus Deis, and out of her bed dragged her husband, and in the next house apprehended a fine young man for a priest, it is rumoured. This was Parsons' pupil Alexander Brandt. In a motet composed at this time, William Byrd set to music Jeremiah's lamentation, Haec Dicit Dominus. It perfectly describes the scene, women weeping, midnight searches. Thus says the Lord, the voice of lamentation, grief and wailing has been heard in heaven, Rachel weeping for her children and not wishing any consolation because they are no more. The Winster copy, the only one of 5 copies still in its original binding, has only recently reappeared. I heard a rumour that this copy had been found, and I asked the parish priest where this was rumoured to have happened, and he said yes, it was true, he had been keeping it in his sock drawer. Still in its vellum manuscript wrapper, it tells us a great deal about this actual process of binding. The manuscript, which is used to wrap this, it's very unusual to have a book from this period still in its original vellum wrapper, and it's particularly unusual to have a Requiem book, because obviously most of them were rebound in the 19th century. The manuscript is a fragment of a lease of property belonging originally to Sir Thomas Dockwray, prior of the late Hospital of St. John of Clerkenwell, and dated to 1562. Since it also mentions Richard, William and Dorothy Bellamy and the parish of Kingsbury and Hendon, there is a strong London provenance. Campion and Parsons regularly rested in Mrs. Bellamy's well-furnished library, which was the first port of call for Father Weston 3 years later. This suggests that this copy may be one of the smaller batch, perhaps 100 copies, bound in Southwark, and that some of the Bellamy family of Oxenden Hall may have been helping with the sewing and the binding. By looking along the surface, I'll show you some versions of that later if we have time. By looking along the surface of the head and tail of this manuscript, top and bottom, one can see that the head and tail were cut professionally with a plough and burnished, while the foredge has been left uncut, thereby ensuring that the margins provide a great deal of space for annotation. This would certainly fit Campion's aims. Within a short time, other editions followed: Rome, Milan, Ingolstadt, Pont-à-Mousson, Cologne, Trier, Paris, Krakow, and many other cities across Europe. By 1632, there had been 72 editions. I think it's an absolute record. I can't think of any other book that goes through quite so many editions in 8 different languages. I'm working with a Polish team in Krakow at the moment, led by Dr. Clorinda Karma, and we've discovered, she's discovered many later editions preserved and annotated lovingly in libraries across Poland and Bohemia. 2 Polish translations, one by Pietro Skarga, another by Gaspar Wilkowski, were produced in Vilnius, together with a Latin edition that replicated exactly the title page of the Stoner Park edition, showing that Prince Radziwiłł had a copy of that. One edition, preserved in the Dominican Library in Krakow, was published as late as 1676. This is a fascinating copy owned by a Polish Dominican called Father Mateusz Kozlowski, who used it, that's the phrase he's written at the bottom, utitor, copied out by hand, and he'd copied out at the end of it a whole page that had obviously come missing, and he's filled it in hand, showing that it was a book that he was still using in 1678, or after 1678, 100 years after it was printed on a secret press in an attic in Berkshire. This would have suited Campion's purpose, which was to defend the Catholic and Apostolic Church, the universal church of the early apostles and martyrs. Campion's argument is based on scriptures, the doctors and councils of the church, and does not get involved at all with the parochial debate which was tearing England apart, whether the Pope or the Queen had sovereignty, an issue that had elicited 844 pages, folio pages, of a massive book produced by Nicholas Sander, another fellow Oxford scholar of New College, on which Campion was interrogated several times on the rack. There's the title page. It was produced in Louvain by John Fowler. Evelyn Waugh deals rather cursorily with the Rationes Decem in his short life, and rather condescendingly describes it as a work of its time. On the contrary, it was markedly different from most other controversial works of its time. Apart from anything else, it was much, much shorter. The books that Lawrence Humphrey wrote in response to it in 2 parts come to 900 pages. It did not address political issues, and as I say, it was astonishingly short. The fact that it was published and translated all over Europe for 100 years reveals its enduring appeal. This is a European book by a European scholar whose preparatory work was in Prague and Munich, and who saw Rome as the shrine of the early apostles and martyrs, and who walked 2,500 miles across Europe dressed as a pilgrim. He met one of his Oxford contemporaries, actually, riding past him, coming back from Rome on horseback, and suddenly thought he recognized this man, and turned around and said, "What on earth are you doing dressed like that, walking along the road?" And Campion explained that he was going as a pilgrim. It must have been a very funny encounter. The first printed life of Campion was published in Paris within a month of Campion's execution. It provides an eyewitness account of his last words on the scaffold. Perfect. As Campion prayed the Pater Noster in Latin, one of the ministers willed him to pray in English, to whom he answered that he would pray and turned to the crowd and, it's a remarkable passage, earnestly begged the Catholics present that although he was in the agony of his death, they would recite with as much fervour as they could the Symbolum Apostolorum, the Apostles' Creed, to show that he was dying for nothing other than the Catholic and Apostolic faith, which is to be found only in the Roman Church. It's typical of Campion that he could think on his feet at such a moment, so that his last words on the scaffold are Vitam aeternam. In the middle of this makeshift stage, constructed for the punishment of treason, Campion transformed a crowd into a congregation fervently reciting together one of the earliest known prayers of the Church, originally used in baptism. For a moment, Campion had transformed the state's secular theatre into a moment of intense religious communion with the early Church of the Martyrs. The choice of prayer allowed them to end with three key phrases: the communion of saints, the resurrection of the dead, and life everlasting. Campion's scholarship was part of a European Latin culture. His devotion to the Ecclesia Romana was expressed in Latin poetry. The language he had spoken in Rome, Prague, Brno, Oxford, the language of a scholar who had consciously and consistently devoted himself to the Catholic and Apostolic Church, and who would have been happy had he been sent, like three of his fellow Jesuits in the same year, to the court of Akbar, the Mughal emperor. Thank you.